Order, please. Before we begin the daily routine, I call upon the Honourable Member Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the opposition parties as well as the government for giving me an opportunity to bring members up to date regarding our friend and colleague, the Minister of Energy, Cecil Clark, and the MLA for Cape Breton North. a number of colleagues, friends, and of course the media are very concerned about Cecil's status. And I spoke to Cecil's executive assistant a little less than an hour ago, and he informs us that Cecil's doing extremely well. He's coherent, he's conscious. The hospital continues to run tests, but Cecil's expected to make a full recovery, and I think it sounded very positive this morning, so I wanted to relay that to all members of the council.
Thank the honourable member for Colchester-Musqueam Valley for that update. Presenting reading petitions. Presenting reports of committees. Table reports, regulations, and other papers. Statements by ministers. Government notice of motion. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Board of Governors of the Nova Scotia Community College announced that Ray Ivany will be stepping down as president of the Nova Scotia Community College at the end of his term in October 2005, whereas the Board of Governors of the Nova Scotia Community College is beginning its search for the next president of the college, whereas the Nova Scotia Community College plays a vital role in the post-secondary education sector of the province in fulfilling the need for applied and technical education so critical to a vibrant provincial economy. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House extend congratulations and best wishes to Ray Ivany, who has provided outstanding leadership to the college during a period of significant growth and development, and to the Nova Scotia Community College and the Board of Governors for their continued success. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice.
For waivers, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Contrary minded, nay. Motion is carried. Introduction to bills. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I'd like to make an introduction before I introduce the bill. And I'd like to introduce in the gallery opposite me Mr. John McFarlane, President of the Nova Scotia Barristers Society, and Mr. Darrell Pink, the Executive Director, who are here today to watch the proceedings of the House relative to the introduction of a bill. I'd like to
Gallery today and hope to enjoy the proceedings. Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act Respecting the Legal Profession.
The Honourable Minister of Justice begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act Respecting the Legal Profession.
House leaders. Yes. Bill 130, entitled An Act Respecting the Legal Profession.
Or this bill be read a second time at a future date. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce an act entitled An Act Respecting Policing in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Minister of Justice begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act Respecting Policing in Nova Scotia.
Bill 131, entitled An Act Respecting Policing in Nova Scotia.
This bill be read a second time at a future date. The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Nova.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 12 of the Revised Status 1989, the Amusement Devices and Safety Act.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Nova begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 12 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Amusement Devices and Safety Act.
Bill 132, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 12 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Amusement Devices and Safety Act.
Or this bill be read a second time at a future date. The Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before I introduce the bill, I'd like to make an introduction of guests in the gallery today. I'd like to draw the attention of the members to the West Gallery, where we have visitors with us today who represent a number of organizations. I'll ask everybody to stand if I could, but I'll just mention a few of the people there. Chris Miller, who was here the other day, is from our area. He represents the Birch Cove Lakes Wilderness Society. Raymond Plourde is with the Ecology Action Centre. Bob McDonald is past president of the Halifax Field Naturalists. And they're also members of these groups, as well as the local Halifax Northwest Trails Association, that have joined us today. So I wonder if they would rise and we could give them a warm welcome. Thank you.
Certainly welcome our guests to the gallery today, the Honourable Member for Halifax-Clayton Park.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 27 of the Acts of 1998, the Wilderness Areas Protection Act.
The Honourable Member for Halifax-Clayton Park begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 27 of the Acts of 1998, the Wilderness Area Protection Act.
Bill 133, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 27 of the Acts of 1998, the Wilderness Areas Protection Act.
Or this bill be read a second time to future date. No motion. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Ray Ivany will leave the post of President of Nova Scotia Community College in October 2005 after 7 years of dedicated service. Whereas the community college has been transformed under his leadership and looks forward to completion of its program of expansion and modernization. And whereas Cape Bretoners and all Nova Scotians have gained from Ray Ivany's commitment to the principles of adult education and to the values of a well-educated and well-trained society. Therefore, be it resolved that this House expresses its appreciation for Ray Ivany's contribution as President of the Nova Scotia Community College and urges him to continue making a positive contribution after his term of office ends next year. Mr. Speaker, I would request for waiver of passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favour say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Cape Breton West.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. We might as well keep symmetry in its finest form here today. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Ray Ivany will be stepping down as president of the Nova Scotia Community College at the end of his term in October 2004, and whereas under Ray's 7-year tenure, the Nova Scotia Community College system has seen unprecedented growth and expansion of programs and services, and whereas the impact of Ray's dynamic and thoughtful vision for the Nova Scotia Community College system will be felt for generations, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate Ray Ivany for his valuable contribution that he has made to the educational system of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I would ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Waivers are agreed. All those in favour say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Guysborough, Sheet Harbour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Hear, hear. Whereas the second annual Guysborough Walk for Liver was held October 3rd in Guysborough with over 80 volunteers raising $7,400. And whereas Dale O'Connor of Guysborough organized the event in support of the Canadian Liver Foundation with proceeds going to education and research.
Order, please. The Member for Guysborough, Sheet Harbour has the floor.
And whereas Dale O'Connor dedicated her heart and soul to this event, having received a liver transplant herself 3.5 years ago. Therefore, be it resolved, the members of the House congratulate Dale O'Connor and all the volunteers who participated in the Guysborough Walk for Liver on a successful event. And I would ask for waiver and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favour say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Cole Harbour, Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Monsieur le Président, je vise que je proposerai à une date ultérieure l'adoption de la résolution suivante. Attendu que la communauté de Public Coast présentera une soirée acadienne avec des artistes locaux le 13 octobre, et attendu que la communauté présentera aussi les après-midi d'échange d'artisanat et de patrons acadiens, et attendu que des activités qui présentent l'art et la musique acadiens sont très importantes pour promouvoir et préserver la culture acadienne en Nouvelle-Écosse. Qu'il soit résolu que cette Assemblée législative félicitant les résidents de la communauté de Public Coast pour le travail pour promouvoir la culture acadienne en Nouvelle-Écosse. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the community of Pubnico West is presenting an Acadian evening featuring local artists on October 13th, 2004, and whereas the community is also presenting afternoons for Acadian artists and patrons, and whereas activities that feature Acadian art and music are very important for promoting the Acadian culture. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this legislature congratulate the residents of Pubnico West for their hard work in promoting Acadian culture in Nova Scotia, and I ask for waiver, Mr. Speaker.
Waivers are agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Blue Mountain Birch Cove Lakes area is a unique parcel of publicly owned land that lies on the doorstep of the fastest growing communities in Nova Scotia, and whereas the tremendous urban growth in the area has generated much concern about the need to balance growth with long-term planning and a vision for the future.
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Whereas these lands are within the immediate proximity of more than 100,000 HRM residents and as such have a tremendous recreational potential as well as potential health and environmental benefits. Therefore be it resolved that the members of this House call for the Government of Nova Scotia to take immediate steps to protect and preserve the Blue Mountain Birch Cove Lakes wilderness area for the benefit of future generations. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Agreed? Here, no. Notice is tabled. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, before I give notice of this resolution, I would like to introduce to members of the House in the Speaker's Gallery Dr. Graham Usher, who is a dental specialist, and Steve Jennings. These gentlemen are involved with the Nova Scotia Dental Association, and this month of October is Sport and Oral Injury Prevention Month, and we'd like to thank them for their involvement on behalf of our citizens. Mr. Speaker, I introduce this motion on behalf of my colleague, the Honourable Rodney MacDonald, Minister of Health Promotion. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Nova Scotia Dental Association has declared October as Sports Oral Injury Prevention Month, as they bring awareness to the importance of protecting one's teeth while playing sports. And whereas research tells us that an athlete without a mouth guard is 60 times more likely to suffer a mouth injury, and so we must remind youth and adults alike as we encourage them to lead active and healthy physical lifestyles to protect their teeth and prevent injury. And whereas two key areas of focus of the Office of Health Promotion are physical activity and injury prevention, and we applaud organizations like the Nova Scotia Dental Association for taking action to help Nova Scotians play safely. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House recognize the Nova Scotia Dental Association for its commitment to the safety of Nova Scotians, and that the members themselves wear mouth guards and prevent injury in sport and recreation, and encourage our families and constituents to do so as well. Mr. Speaker, before I seek waiver, perhaps the House could extend a warm welcome to our guests in the gallery today.
Request for waivers is agreed. Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, before I do my resolution, I'd like to make an introduction with your permission. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, today in our West Gallery, we are joined by three guests, George Marcello, Merle Roberts, and Christopher Knowles. They are going across the country on a public awareness campaign called Christopher's Wish. There's a very excellent website you can go to get more information. And they will be at City Hall today doing a press conference in their effort to raise awareness around the importance of every Canadian becoming an organ donor, signing their card in the eventuality that – So I'd like to extend the welcome of the members to these guests in our gallery, and I'd ask them to rise, please. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 14-year-old Christopher Knowles needs a liver transplant, and whereas in the spirit of his health challenges, Christopher is here today on day 275 of a 350-day, 200-city cross-Canada walk to raise awareness about organ donation, and whereas his project, Christopher's Wish, has one goal, that every Canadian become an organ donor, therefore be it resolved that the members of this legislature congratulate Christopher Knowles on his courageous efforts to raise organ donation awareness and pledge to him that all members will make every effort to promote organ donation in the province of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I seek waiver and passage without debate.
Question for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Valley Regional Hospital in Kentville has just launched the innovative literacy program Read to Me, and whereas every new parent at the hospital receives a bright yellow Read to Me gift bag filled with books and literacy resources within 24 hours of their baby's birth, and whereas this wonderful program has been established to address low literacy rates and reaches 10,000 infants across the province each year, therefore be resolved that the members of this House congratulate the Valley Regional Hospital in Kentville on this fantastic new program and their site director, Mrs. Margaret Jenkins, and wish it continued future success. I request waiver of notice.
Question for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Hants East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas farmers are arguably our most important economic sector, and whereas our increasingly urban population has less and less opportunity to connect with farmers, especially on their farms, and whereas on September 26, 2004, 46 farms throughout Nova Scotia, including 3 in Hants East, took part in Open Farm Day hosted by the Nova Scotia Agricultural Awareness Committee to allow the general public a chance to tour their farms and to explain their operations. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly congratulate the farmers taking part in Open Farm Day and the committee members for their forward-thinking initiative. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Question for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. The motion is carried. The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Master Corporal David Michael Pawlowski of Waterville, Nova Scotia, despite a serious back and neck fractures sustained in a July 18, 2002 helicopter crash in the heavily wooded area of northeastern Labrador, managed to extricate himself from the wreckage of his downed helicopter, and whereas Michael Corporal Pawlowski, after assessing the condition of his 3 teammates and freeing the other surviving crew member, was able to place a distress call and drag himself from the wreckage to administer first aid. And whereas ignoring his own pain, spent the ensuing 2.5 hours preparing signals to alert a search and rescue team sent out to locate the site of the crash. Therefore, be it resolved that in view of his heroic actions and his perseverance in facilitating the rescue of his helicopter crew, the members of this House acknowledge and praise Master Corporal David Michael Pawlowski on being presented the Star of Courage for his act of conspicuous courage in circumstances of great peril by His Excellency the Right Honourable Adrian Clarkson, Governor-General of Canada, on June the 25th, 2004. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Question for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on June 21st, 2004, the East Dartmouth Boys and Girls Club held their annual general meeting and awards night. And whereas members and volunteers were honoured for their hard work and ongoing dedication, and whereas the East Dartmouth Boys and Girls Club had another successful year thanks to the support of volunteers, board members, staff, and the community as a whole, therefore be it resolved that this House congratulate all of the East Dartmouth Boys and Girls Club Award Night recipients and wish them all the best in the future. And Mr. Speaker, I would ask for waiver and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas in 2001, the Provincial Department of Energy identified active and inactive sites for strip mining in its long-term energy strategy, and whereas Birch Grove was not referenced anywhere in this report, and whereas 20 years ago, in September 1984, the residents of Birch Grove, the local Tory MLA, and the Department of Energy rejected Birch Grove as a site for strip mining. Therefore, be it resolved that the Minister of Natural Resources explain fully why he is encouraging strip mining activity in Birch Grove, and further explain where interests are being serviced.
Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Colchester, Musqueam Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the 5th Annual Firefighters Combat Challenge hosted by the Hilton Fire Brigade took place 2 weeks ago, and whereas fire departments and brigades from Brookfield, Bible Hill, Cobequid, North River, Middle Musqueam, Beaver Bank, and Upper Stewiacke all participated, and whereas the Upper Stewiacke Fire Department entered a total of 3 teams in the 9-team overall competition, placing 1st, 3rd, and 9th, while in the individual competitions, Upper Stewiacke firefighters were a force to be reckoned with, as well finishing 2nd and 3rd, while also winning the over 40 female and junior divisions along with the People's Choice Award. Therefore, be it resolved that members of this House extend our congratulations to the Upper Stewiacke Fire Department for a commendable effort, and to all fire departments and brigades that entered the 5th Annual Firefighters Combat Challenge in Hildon, Colchester County in the beautiful Colchester, Musqueam Valley. Mr. Speaker, I would request waiver of notice.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax Atlantic.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas residents' associations are a time-honoured and effective way for communities to voice and address local concerns, and whereas the Ketch Harbour Area Residents Association was formed in 1999 and has since then rebuilt the government wharf, advocated for the protection of the Duncan's Cove Barrens, and was working to preserve the Chebucto Head Lighthouse, site of many of Helen Creighton's field recordings. And whereas Cara has not been deterred by the destruction of the Lightkeeper's house this summer, but in September opened the new community wharf and hosted a day of dory racing, therefore be it resolved that this House support the establishment of residents' associations wherever possible, and commend the work of the Ketch Harbour Area Residents Association in particular. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia, and Municipal Relations.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Michael Hunter, a singer and songwriter from Lower Sackville, released his first single this summer called They Might Say from his first album, People Will Believe Anything If You Whisper It. And whereas Michael started writing songs at the age of 14, and when not studying at the University of Toronto, he now enjoys listening to his songs on major radio stations. And whereas Michael is planning a maritime tour with his band this fall, with further information available online at www.michaelhunter.com, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House join me in sending out congratulations to Michael Hunter and wish him great success with his music career. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried. The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the roads and bridges of Nova Scotia are needed to provide essential emergency services to the residents of Nova Scotia, and whereas the Eureka Fire Department in Pictou County has informed the province that it no longer will be crossing the bridge spanning the river between Churchville and Eureka, and whereas the Department of Transportation plans to replace the bridge spanning the river between Churchville and Eureka in 2005, therefore be resolved that this government repair the bridge spanning the river between Churchville and Eureka as soon as possible to ensure emergency services will continue. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas North Shore, Colchester County 4-H member Jamie Fraser from Bay Head recently won a $1,500 national scholarship from Farm Credit Canada, and whereas Jamie was one of only 6 4-H members from across Canada to receive this esteemed scholarship, and whereas Jamie attends grade 12 at North Colchester High in Tattamagush, and to go along with her scholarship, she won a $3,000 grant to begin work on a project involving the second publication of Celebrating the Harvest, a local foods guide. Therefore, be it resolved that Jamie Fraser be applauded by all members for her meaningful work in both education and agriculture, and wish her continued success with the harvest supper she is working on with local farmers. And Mr. Speaker, I request waivers.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Dartmouth South, Portland Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Dartmouth Heritage Museum is a non-profit community-based facility that develops and supports Dartmouth's cultural and heritage life, and whereas the Dartmouth Heritage Museum Society and Mermaid Theatre of Nova Scotia celebrated the opening of the House of Imagination at Evergreen House in Dartmouth, October 7th, 2004, and whereas the exhibition of Mermaid Theatre's whimsical puppets are delighting young and old, therefore be it resolved that the Nova Scotia Legislature congratulate the Dartmouth Heritage Museum Society and museum staff and Mermaid Theatre of Nova Scotia for their creative partnership in the House of Imagination, and thank them for their ongoing contributions to the culture and heritage of this province. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
No. Request for waivers is agreed. Agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on the future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Master Corporal Joseph Carl Steve Bedard of Greenwood and Sergeant Joseph Andre Houghton of Berwick, Nova Scotia, in their work as search and rescue technicians, parachuted into a heavily forested crash site to rescue a severely injured man following a helicopter crash in a rugged and mountainous area near Nataqua, Quebec, on September 30, 2002. And whereas without concern for their personal safety and using improvisational means, they managed to free the sole survivor trapped in the crushed wreckage. And whereas in cold and dark conditions, both provided care to the suffering man until a rescue helicopter arrived to airlift them to safety some 7 hours later. Therefore, be it resolved that members of this House commend Master Corporal Bedard and Sergeant Houghton for their acts of bravery in hazardous circumstances and offer congratulations on being awarded the Medal of Bravery by Her Excellency the Right Honourable Adrian Clarkson, Governor General of Canada, at ceremonies held June the 25th, 2004. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice, passage without debate.
Waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day to move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas nearly 40% of women will develop cancer during their lifetimes, making it the leading cause of premature death in Canada, and whereas the early detection of cancer increases the chances of successful treatment, and whereas the 8th annual Well Women's Clinic is being held in Liverpool on October the 15th, 2004, to offer information and services to women in the area in an effort to decrease cancer rates in Queens County. Therefore, be it reserved that all members of this House encourage women to help reduce cancer rates in Queens County by attending this free clinic, and thank the staff of the Well Women's Clinic for their important contributions to women's health. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried. The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on Saturday, September the 18th, 2004, I attended the Eastern Shore Wildlife Rehabilitation and Rescue Center's fun, informative open house along with many other families and children. And whereas the non-profit volunteer-driven center relies entirely on donations from the public and veterinary requirements are generously donated by the Dartmouth Veterinary Hospital, and whereas the center specializes in the treatment and rehabilitation of injured or orphaned native fur-bearing animals, seabirds, and songbirds, of which service I was able to access recently when a seabird became stranded in my yard. Therefore, be it resolved that this House recognize the important service that the Eastern Shore Wildlife Rehabilitation Center is providing, and thank all those who have a part in making it possible. And, Mr. Speaker, I request waiver and passage without debate.
Waivers are agreed. All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas sadly, Raleigh Orr of Truro, a true champion for bettering the lives of disabled persons in our community, our province, and our country, recently passed away. Whereas Raleigh Orr did not let the challenge of muscular dystrophy impair his work on behalf of other disabled persons, and he served as chair of the Nova Scotia League of Equal Opportunities and as chair of the Nova Scotia Human Rights Society. Whereas Raleigh Orr, a retired school teacher and principal, was a founding member of the Disabled Consumer Societies for the Truro and Colchester region. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House recognize the outstanding contribution Raleigh Orr made to improving the lives of disabled persons and extend sincere sympathy to his wife Lillian, his children and grandchildren on their loss. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Nova Scotia must develop a strategy to help problem gamblers in Nova Scotia, especially those who are addicted to VLTs. And whereas the NDP has been trying to force the Ham government to quickly and responsibly deal with this issue by holding public hearings as soon as possible. And whereas the Liberals have indicated that VLT use and gambling addiction was a major problem in this province, yet leadership candidate Francis McKenzie wants to install more VLTs in Nova Scotia and start a casino. Therefore, be it resolved that the Liberal Party of Nova Scotia, long known for saying one thing and doing another, be congratulated for being consistent, then consistently right. And, Mr. Speaker, I will not be requesting waiver. This resolution may be fodder for a future day.
Table. Now, Member Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia brings the visual arts and people together in an environment which encourages exploration, dialogue, and enjoyment. And whereas the Art Gallery is an agency of the Government of Nova Scotia and that this government has continually cut its funding. And whereas due to these cuts in funding, the Nova Scotia Arts Gallery has had to discontinue its free admission days where visitors could enjoy the beauty and culture the gallery provides at no cost. Therefore, be it resolved that this government adequately fund the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia so free admission days can once again be enjoyed by all people of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I request a waiver of notice and pass.
No. Notice is table. The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Nova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Scout movement teaches youth how to solve practical problems, participate in community projects and volunteer work, and how to set and achieve goals for themselves as well as numerous outdoor activities. And whereas the Howell family of Sydney, Nova Scotia, named Linda and Rick, and their two sons, Kyler and Nash, are members of the St. Teresa's 5th Vanier Scouts. Whereas for the past 10 years they have volunteered and participated in the Scouts Canada movement. Therefore, be it resolved, the members of the Legislative Assembly congratulate the Howell family for the dedication and commitment for the Scouting movement and for them being emblematic of the motto, the family that plays together stays together. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Timberlea Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption following resolution. Whereas on Sunday, September 12, 2004, Lighthouse Celebration Day was held in Sandy Cove, Terrence Bay, Nova Scotia. And whereas community volunteers continue to work towards making this historic lighthouse an integral part of the legendary coastal community. And whereas a wonderful afternoon was enjoyed by the many in attendance. Therefore, be it resolved, the Nova Scotia Legislature congratulate this Lighthouse Committee with best wishes for much success in their future endeavours. I ask for waiver and passage without debate, Mr. Speaker.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour on an introduction.
Speaker, I'd like to take this opportunity to make an introduction to a couple who are in the gallery opposite. and they were here yesterday touring and viewing the house. And I'd like to introduce Marilyn and David Birkenstein from Winnetka, Illinois. And they've been enjoying their vacation here in Halifax, and we certainly hope they enjoy the proceedings of the House. So we'd ask if they would stand and receive the warm applause of the House.
Certainly welcome our visitors from the U.S. and hope they enjoy their stay here. The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Dartmouth Boys and Girls Club has celebrated its 40th anniversary of playing an integral part in the lives of many Dartmouth children and youth, and whereas over 40 years the Dartmouth Boys and Girls Club has expanded its programs and services to reach out to other organizations in the community, and whereas the benefits of the Dartmouth Boys and Girls Club can be measured by the educational achievements and successful careers of many of the children and youth that have entered its doors. Therefore, be it resolved that the Nova Scotia Legislature congratulate the Dartmouth Boys and Girls Club on reaching their 40th anniversary and commend the club for its dedicated service to our children and youth. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favour say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas this week marks Fire Prevention Week in Canada and a week dedicated to promoting fire safety, including the use of smoke detectors to save lives, and where it has been a year since tragedy struck a family living in provincial housing because they did not have battery-operated backup smoke detectors for power outages. And whereas, in spite of calls to provide battery-operated smoke detectors in all provincial-owned housing to prevent such a tragedy from happening again, the government has taken no action. Therefore, be it resolved that the Minister of Community Services undertake a plan to install battery-operated smoke detectors in public housing in order to prevent needless suffering for any more families, Mr. Speaker. And I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver, here or no. Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Timberlea Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the SS Atlantic Heritage Park Society hosted on September 11, 2004, a chowder and chat at the Terrence Bay Fire Hall with Professor William Flayhart of the Delaware State University, and whereas Professor Flayhart spoke on the perils of the Atlantic, and whereas all in attendance enjoyed a great evening, therefore be it resolved that the Nova Scotia House of Assembly congratulate the SS Atlantic Heritage Park Society for its initiative and thank Professor Flayhart for his insightful presentation. I had a problem getting it out, but there it is. May I have a waiver on that, Mr. Speaker?
Agreed. All those in favour say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Dartmouth South, Portland Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Women's Rights Committee of the Nova Scotia NDP is committed to encouraging and supporting more women to run as candidates in provincial elections, and whereas this Women's Rights Committee organized a day-long workshop held in East Preston last year on topics of interest to potential women candidates, and whereas a registration fee of $15, which included the cost of lunch, allowed women from across the province and representing different socioeconomic and cultural groups to share information and experiences with a number of resource people. Therefore, be it resolved that the Nova Scotia Legislature congratulate the Nova Scotia New Democratic Party's Women's Rights Committee for their vision, energy, and practical approach to supporting women candidates in this province. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Waiver, here or no. Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the River John Community Access Program, CAP, has been operating successfully for more than 10 years in the River John Library's Innovation Centre, and whereas Pictou-Antigonish Regional Library Manager Eric Stackhouse describes it as a jewel, adding it is the most used site per capita in the province, with more than 50 people signing in each day. And whereas the River John CAP site is operated by volunteers, including founding member Abdul Rahman, who was recently honored for his dedicated service and who will soon be moving out of province. Therefore, it be resolved that this Nova Scotia Legislature congratulate Mr. Rahman and all the volunteers for their countless hours of service to the people of the area throughout the River John Community Access Program and wish them continued success. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Question for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Countermanded nay. Motion is carried. Orders of the day, government business. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call the order of business public bills for second reading?
Public bills for second reading.
Mr. Speaker, would you please call Bill number 129, the Pension Benefits Act?
Bill number 129, the Pension Benefits Act. The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to rise to begin second reading on Bill 129 regarding the amendments to the Pension Benefits Act. I'll spend just a few minutes outlining the amendments that we're proposing and speak very briefly on the principles of the legislation. Mr. Speaker, the amendment responds to the needs and the requests from pension plan sponsors, namely those pension plans for municipalities, universities, schools, hospitals, and the private sector. Currently, under the Pension Benefits Act, plan administrators are required to provide eligible members with the right to grow in to unreduced early retirement benefits where a defined pension plan is winding up. This amendment would remove that requirement for all pension plans. Mr. Speaker, the change will reduce the contributions required to provide for those liabilities. We are accommodating this request first because it has broad support from the employers, the various unions and associated groups such as the Federation of Labour, Halifax Regional Municipality, the Nova Scotia Association of Health Organizations, and private companies. And second, because we find it to be reasonable as this cost is imposed only on pension plans that provide generous early retirement benefits. It's not a cost for all defined plans. The approach is also consistent with other jurisdictions and with model pension legislation. It's also consistent with pension amendments made in the past in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. In 2003, after full consultation and with the agreement of the construction industry, this grow-in benefit was removed from their defined pension plans. I'd like to make it very clear, this particular amendment in no way affects an employee's pension at age 65. This grow-in is an extra top-up benefit that in fact has the potential to affect few people because it would only apply under very specific and unusual circumstances, and those circumstances are that the employee must be in a defined benefit plan. The plan must allow for subsidized early retirement benefits. All or part of the operation must close down. The employee must be at the point and have years of service and age adding up to 55. And so therefore, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to move second reading of Bill 129 today. Thank you.
Thank you. I recognize the member for Halifax Shabakto.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a very interesting bill. I'm happy to take the opportunity to make a few remarks on behalf of our caucus. You and the Honourable Minister will know that I am not the critic for labour relations matters, nor indeed the critic at this point for finance issues, which would normally extend, of course, to the financing of at least some of the pensions that exist in the province. However, I have been asked to speak to this legislation, and I'm happy to do so. Reading the bill, it's an extremely short bill, and it has really one purpose, which is to remove from the existing Pension Benefits Act in Nova Scotia a provision which is common to our province and to Ontario. It's a provision which I believe does not exist in any other province in Canada. And yet, just to jump ahead so as not to leave the minister or his colleagues or any other listeners in any doubt as to where we stand on this, our caucus has decided that we cannot support this initiative from the government. So therefore, we will not be supporting this bill at second reading. What I intend to do today is to explain why it is that we have arrived at this conclusion, because we have no hesitation about that. So let me start by doing a quick review of the proposal that comes forward before we turn to the actual content of what it is that the bill means. Members will recall that the government announced as part of the budgetary process in the spring of this year that they had the intention of bringing forward such legislation, that they had the intention of ending the so-called grow-in provision as it exists under the Pension Benefits Act of the province. At that time, the issue was flagged as one of some concern. At that time, there was some confusion as to whether there was actual support from the organized labor movement in Nova Scotia. There was some confusion as to which employers were interested in this. There was some confusion as to who supported it and who opposed it. There was some confusion as to whether it was a good or a bad idea. The government at the time, as part of the budgetary process, decided that it would not attempt at that point to proceed with legislation. What's happened in the interim is that the government has, I gather, reconsidered its position and yet decided still that it wishes to go forward with legislation that takes away the so-called grow-in provisions. Now, I think it's important that we just take a minute to understand exactly what it is that we're focusing on here, exactly what it is that the government is saying that it wants to do away with. I discovered very early on in my practice as a lawyer that pensions are matters that are quite technical and they're a matter for experts. Pension laws and pension agreements themselves can be extremely convoluted, extremely difficult to understand. And yet there are some parts of them that are fairly clear. Pensions, for example, everyone understands, are meant to provide some income for people after they cease their full-time or part-time employment in their jobs or professions. The idea is to put money aside until a particular age is reached. Frequently, that age is seen as being age 65. Usually what happens in some workplaces is that an employer is a partial contributor to a pension plan, and the employees are partial contributors to pension plans. But of course, this is not true in all workplaces. Pensions are seen as a benefit, and of course, they have to be negotiated as part of the terms and conditions of employment between the employees and the employer. So not all workplaces do have pension plans. In fact, I was a little surprised to learn just recently from the superintendent of pensions in the province of Nova Scotia that there are only 150, maybe the number is 140, private pension plans that she superintends in Nova Scotia. Now that was, to my mind, a shockingly small number. But be that as it may, we do know that there are a lot of workplaces where there are no pension plans. It's a very good thing to have a pension plan. It's a very good thing for employees to have some means of enforced savings that will work towards helping them when they retire. Now, I learned when I first started to study pensions that actuaries and pensions experts think of pensions by two main designations. There are what are called defined contribution plans and defined benefit plans. A defined contribution plan is one in which the employer and the employees put money into a fund, and come the day the employee retires, their share of the fund is taken out and is used to buy an annuity of some sort, and that gives them their pension. End of story, essentially. It's a defined contribution plan. The employer is making no promise as to what the level of the pension will be. All they're doing, and all the employee is doing during the years of employment, is putting money into the fund. And on the day they retire, their share of the fund is taken out and invested. I want to say, of course, that this is an extremely risky proposition for employees. This is easily illustrated by thinking about the situation in 1987 with respect to the stock market. An employee who retired, say, in July or August of 1987, having worked, say, 30 years for an employer, would have taken their share of the pension plan out, and it would have been invested in their annuity. But everyone remembers that in October of 1987, there was a very severe decline in the value of the stock market. And a colleague of that same employer, that same employee as well, who had worked the same 30 years for that company, but who retired in November instead of July, August, or September, retiring with their share of the pension plan on a defined contribution plan, would have retired with a pension valued approximately 1/3 less than their colleague who had retired a month or two before. That's a defined contribution plan, and it's risky. But you know what? This is not what we're talking about today. We're talking about a different kind of plan. We're talking about the defined benefit plan, because this is the second type of plan that exists, broadly speaking. And in this plan, what happens is that the employer and the employees agree to make contributions to the plan, but at the same time, the plan also goes on to define the nature of the benefits that the employees will receive when they retire. And indeed, the employer stands as guarantor of those benefits. That's part of what makes this a different kind of plan, what's known as a defined benefit plan. And we're probably, many of us, familiar with the nature of the usual form of the defined benefit. Usually it's expressed as a certain percentage, usually around 2%, of your average few best years of salary, perhaps the last 3, perhaps the last 5, multiplied by the number of years of employment. This is a standard formula. So, for example, someone who has worked 35 years would get 2 times 35, that is 70% of the average of their 3 or 5 best years of their salary upon retirement. That is the typical, and I should say perhaps not one of the best forms. Those numbers that I'm giving would be the best forms because, in fact, there are federal rules under the Income Tax Act that do limit the maximum amount of pension that can be paid. So 70% would be the maximum amount that could be paid out as a pension. But that's the form of what makes it a defined benefit plan. And crucially, the employer is guaranteeing that that pension will be paid. So how do they do that? The way they do that is by attempting to make sure that during the lifetime of the plan, during the years in which the business is in operation, the money is invested in a professional way so as to generate enough returns to make sure that there's enough money there to pay their employees when they retire. That's what pension investments are all about. So to take the example I gave a minute ago of the downturn in the stock market in 1987, that would not, under a defined benefit plan, have affected the pension entitlements of the employees who retired in the summer or later in the fall. They would both get the same amounts of money. And the performance of the stock market over the years would of course have some bearing on the ability of the plan to pay, but the plan would still be obliged to pay the guaranteed pension upon retirement. So both the employees and the employers have a duty to oversee and look to make sure that the plan is invested in a solid and responsible fashion in order to make sure that the money is generated over the years. Excuse me, Mr. Speaker, did you want an interruption? Absolutely, thank you. Yeah.
Cape Breton Nova on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to bring your attention to the West Gallery. In the West Gallery today, we have my nephew, actually from Cape Breton, who's in college here. Ryan Goss is up visiting, taking in the procedure today. I'd like to give him a warm welcome.
Certainly welcome Brian to the gallery today and hope he enjoys the proceedings. Thank you, and thanks to the honourable member for Halifax Shabukto. Now has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's always a pleasure to see relatives of my colleagues coming here to enjoy the proceedings. Mr. Speaker, I was saying that the second kind of pension plan, the defined benefit plan, is the one we're really focusing on here today through this legislation. And under these plans, what happens is that there is usually a process of negotiation between the employer and the employees that will set many of the terms of the benefit, this main benefit known as a pension plan. So, for example, in a negotiation process, the employer and the employees will negotiate the amount of money, usually expressed as a percentage of wages, that will be contributed to the plan. And they will also negotiate the benefits that are payable under the plan. And sometimes those benefits change. Usually, a good pension plan is something that a group of employees will be very interested in negotiating for. It won't be the only thing they're interested in negotiating for, but it will certainly be one of the things that they will look for, along with wages and other forms of benefits like an extended health care plan or a dental plan or life insurance and so on. Now, when negotiations take place, they're designed to provide benefits, but also to provide for other contingencies in the workplace. One of the contingencies that sometimes arises in a workplace is that an employer will desire that some of their employees retire early. Now, the normal thing is that employees will retire at age 65. Now, when I say normal, what I mean is that usually age 65 will be the point in employment at which full entitlement to full pension benefits will have been earned. And that's a crucial date. But sometimes in workplaces, employers take the view that they want their employees to retire earlier than that. And they will come to the employees as part of the negotiation process that may come up at the expiry of a collective agreement, or they may come to their employees in the middle of a contract because circumstances might have changed. And the employer will say, we would like to negotiate early retirement, a special early retirement package for some members of the union, some workers in the workplace. Now, sometimes this happens because there is going to be some kind of merger or amalgamation of the businesses. Or sometimes it'll happen because the employer wants to expand but is desirous of bringing on new people who have less experience. There are a variety of things that might move an employer to come and speak to the union and say, we want to negotiate some kind of early retirement plan. Now, when this happens, of course, all elements of the plan are open to negotiation. By that I mean all elements of the retirement plan are open to negotiation, because if an employee is being invited to think about retiring early, then they have to say to themselves, well, what about my pension? Am I still going to get my full pension? And if so, when do I get my full pension? Or do I get less of a pension? And sometimes it's not just the employer who wants a group of employees to retire early. Sometimes it's individual employees who might come along and say, well, I'm kind of interested in retiring at age 50 or 55 or 60 instead of waiting till I'm 65. And that happens a lot. A lot of people will look at it and make their own judgments based on their own individual circumstances, in which they say to themselves, you know what, I'm going to be a lot happier in life if I'm retired when I'm 55 rather than waiting till I'm 65. So what happens is this. Usually what happens is that their pension, if they voluntarily want to get out, will be what's called actuarially reduced. Actuaries are a profession that are able to look at pension plans and give advice to employers and to employees about how pension plans should be funded, about how much money is needed. And they base this on general life expectancy tables. They base this on tables looking at the specifics of the age profile of a group of employees in a particular workplace. They base it looking in part on the performance of the investments of the funds, and so they're required and are able to give advice to the employers and the employees about the amount of money that's needed in the pension plan. And actuaries have made suggestions as to the kind of reductions in the pension that should be paid to an employee if they voluntarily take early retirement. And the usual number is that for every month of early retirement, there's, I believe it's 1/10 or 1/12 of 1% of the pension that is reduced. So early retirement can, in fact, very reasonably, will, when an employee voluntarily on their own comes forward and says, I want to retire early, it will be reduced. And that's a reasonable thing. So people know that if they haven't worked for the full expected 30 or 35 years and they retire early, they're going to take less of a pension because they've missed out on 5 or 10 years of making contributions to the plan. And indeed, there's 5 or 10 years in which the employer has not made contributions to the plan on behalf of that employee. So if they retire early, if they choose to retire early, naturally there's going to be a reduction. That's not unusual. But we're not talking about that situation either. What we're talking about is a situation in which the employer desires to reduce their workforce and to put in place an early retirement scheme. This is a situation which, for whatever reason, and I've suggested earlier a few, the employer comes along and invents a scheme in which they're trying to induce the employees to retire early. And many of us who have worked in employer-employee relations, or any of us who have sometimes been employed in businesses or enterprises, including sometimes government departments, that have gone through this kind of exercise, will be familiar with some of the typical forms of the inducements that employers offer. One, for example, is sometimes referred to as a rule of 80 or a rule of 85. And this is an inducement in which the employer says, well, look, if your age plus your years of service add up to 80 or 85, then you can retire now and take your full pension. You don't have to wait till you're 65. So if it was a rule of 80, if someone was 50 and they'd worked for 30 years, they would be able to retire at age 50 with their full pension. Now, you know what? That's a great benefit. But I'm talking about the circumstances in which the employer comes forward on their own and offers this kind of inducement. They may have their reasons. And sometimes those kinds of plans are put in place. And sometimes they're put in place as a one-time or short-term special offer. Available now, take it or leave it. That's known. But you know what? There's another circumstance. And there's a circumstance in which employers will sometimes offer this kind of early retirement on an ongoing basis. They will offer it as a benefit on an ongoing basis. It doesn't happen a lot, but it's sometimes there. Now, if that happens, it's not usually so extremely generous. Typically, it might well have been negotiated between the employer and the employees. And usually, it'll focus on encouraging employees to retire at around age 60. That is to say, 5 years earlier than the normal retirement date. And when this is part of the scheme that the employer and the employees have worked out, then this is not mandatory. Usually it's an option. And now we have to think about the actuaries again. Because one of the things that the actuaries do, as I said, is they advise the employer and the employees how much money has to go into the plan. And they do it based on the terms of the plan, among many other factors. And when one of the factors in the design of the plan is an ongoing early retirement inducement, the actuaries have to think about that. And they do think about that. They think about it, and it's part of their calculations of how much money has to go into the plan. They know that the inducement is there. They know that a certain number, or they predict that a certain number of employees will take up that inducement. And based on that, along with all the other factors about age profile and life expectancy and investments, they advise the employer and the employees as to the amount of money that has to go into the plan. In other words, what I'm saying is that this kind of early retirement is already factored into the actuarial assumptions as to the necessary funding for the plan. Well, now the situation gets a little more complicated. And here's the problem. Problem is, if you have an employer in a defined benefit plan which includes one of these ongoing inducements for early retirement, and the employer goes out of business before the employees qualify for their retirement benefit, then what? And it doesn't have to be if the employer goes out of business completely. It could be that they go out of business partially in the part where some employees were interested in retiring. Just think back to that rule of 80 that I talked about, or maybe it's a rule of 85. Think about an employee that has been working towards this, thinking that say they're going to retire with full benefit, full pension that's been promised to them under this early retirement scheme, and contributions have been made on that basis up to the date, and 2 years before they actually qualify for this early retirement benefit, the employer decides they're going to close up shop, go to business in whole or in part. Or it might be that there's a merger. It might be that two companies merge and the two pension plans, or maybe more pension plans, have to be put together. And some of the employees are eliminated. It's going to go. Now, it's that situation that we're talking about. And I want to remind members that the minister said there are very few people who are going to be affected by this. Now, I'm sure members can understand now that I've put this in context, that that's probably right. There probably are relatively few people who are going to be caught in this situation. Interestingly, the minister went on to say, having once said that there are very few people who are going to be affected, he went on to say that there are millions of dollars at stake and it's an urgent problem. Well, you know, on the face of it, those are not exactly consistent statements. That there are very few people and it hardly ever comes up, compared with the statement that there are millions and millions of dollars at risk and that it's an urgent problem. But we'll get to that in a minute. So let's just concentrate for a moment on the fact that it doesn't come up a huge amount, but it does occur. It occurred, for example, I'm familiar with the circumstance at Halifax Regional Municipality. I should tell the minister and you, Mr. Speaker, and members that I was a former municipal councillor. I was a member of the city council in the city of Halifax and of the council for Halifax Regional Municipality. Now, when I was a councillor at the city of Halifax, I guess alderman was the term that was used then, when I was an alderman at the city of Halifax, I chaired the city's pension committee. There was a pension committee that was made up of the people who were managing the plan, that is the city administrators, because many of them were part of the plan as well. There were a number of different employee groups that were involved in it. At that time, I don't think the councillors were involved in the pension plan, although I think later some of them were. But I chaired that committee and got to know fairly intimately what it was that was going on with that plan. But of course, at the time of amalgamation in 1996, the city of Halifax and the city of Dartmouth and the town of Bedford and the municipality of the county of Halifax all became one entity. And one of the problems that had to be worked out in the ensuing years was how there was going to be a merger of those pension plans. There didn't have to be, but it made sense to try to bring them all together into one pension plan. And there was a problem of working out the valuation of people's respective earlier contributions to their plans and looking at how their respective plans had performed over the years. And this was a very difficult exercise. And it went on for months and months and months and months. There were endless meetings. Mercer, which is a well-known Canadian pension advisory company, was involved on the technical side. All of the unions that were involved had their representatives. Management was at the table. There were very complicated discussions. So this was an example of where it is that some people were essentially invited to take some early retirement because those kinds of inducements were brought on board. Now, Nova Scotia has a provision in the law right now that addresses the question of wind-up, full or partial wind-up, of a pension plan where this kind of early retirement benefit is in place. And what our law says at the moment is that employees are able to assume that they would have met the requirement. And this is what's called the grow-in provision. The assumption of the statute in Nova Scotia, and indeed in Ontario, is that employees that have reached a certain stage in their employment are entitled to the benefit of early retirement that they have been promised by their employers. So there are further contributions that are necessary in order to make that up, but the point is that early closure of the workplace in whole or in part does not deprive those employees of this benefit that will have been offered by the employer or negotiated through a process between the employer and the employees. And it's easy to understand the policy of that. The policy recognizes that an inducement has been put in place. The policy recognizes that there's a legitimate expectation. The policy recognizes as well that in the preceding years of employment, that the employee contributions and the employer contributions will have been gauged to a level that, on the advice of the actuaries, took into account the fact that there was an early retirement benefit built into the plan. So it's not as if the employees or the employer have not been paying based on the assumption that there was an early retirement benefit built into the plan. So we have this protection. This protection says that to some employees, if they've gotten a certain length of time into their employment, they can still move on to qualify for the early retirement benefit that they had been promised and that they had been paying for. Bill 129 proposes to take that away. That's the point. Bill 129 says, why don't we take that away? Why don't we take away the legislated protection for those employees who were caught in this squeeze? Why don't we take away the legislated protection that Nova Scotia workers who have an early retirement benefit that they've negotiated, but they haven't quite reached it, let's take away the promise in the legislation that says to them, you're going to be able to still qualify for that early retirement benefit. And I say, why? Why do we want to do this? As I said at the beginning, we've reached the conclusion that it doesn't seem appropriate and we don't want to support it. Now, I apologize for taking such a long time to get to the point of explaining what it is that we're dealing with, but it does require a certain amount of technical analysis that I thought was so exceedingly compressed in the Honourable Minister's statement at the beginning that many members here who might not have dealt with pensions would be a little puzzled by. So now that we can focus on this, that I think explains what it is that our concern is. Our concern is that Nova Scotia workers have been offered a statutory protection that is an appropriate protection for something that is a real circumstance that comes up from time to time and that is now being proposed to be taken away. Now, what can we make of this? How is it that this comes forward? I pointed to the history of the one example. Excuse me, Mr. Speaker, I think an honourable member might have an interjection.
The honourable member for Cape Breton West, and a point of order.
No, a question, Mr. Speaker. I believe the honourable member has indicated he's prepared to accept a question. Yes.
Is that the case, honourable member? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes.
Okay, proceed with your question, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member has just indicated that there are particular cases that come up from time to time. Perhaps if you'd be kind enough to provide us some indication of one or two of those circumstances.
Recognize honourable member for Halifax, Shabakto.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very pleased that the honourable member is paying attention because that's exactly the point I had reached in my speech. I was in fact about to turn to some other examples. I had mentioned the example of Halifax Regional Municipality, but you know what? Another example that we should remember is the time of the closure of the Ultramar refinery in Eastern Passage. At the time of the closure of that refinery, there were employees who were in exactly that position. They were in exactly that position, faced with not a partial closure, but a full closure and a wind-up of the plan, and they had this set of circumstances. So I want to put that on record as being one of the examples that we have here in Nova Scotia. And you know what? There are other examples around the country where this has come up. And I think what really prompted this statutory protection for employees in our province and in Ontario was the wind-up of the Massey-Ferguson plant operations in Ontario. Because there were employees there who were caught in that squeeze. And I think that, as I recall, was the prompting for the province of Ontario to bring in this kind of protection in the first place. So I thank the member for his question, and that is the answer. This is not a unique situation. So where are we with this? Because so far as I can tell from looking at the record of the materials that the Minister has put in front of this House, or at the materials that have passed back and forth among interested parties when this first came up in the spring, the immediate prompting actually seems to come from HRM. We actually have a letter from His Worship the Mayor of HRM passing on to us a request from the Pension Committee of HRM asking that this change be made. And I'll get to that in a moment. But that, although it might be the immediate prompting, is not the only history or background to this proposal. We do know that this is an idea that has emerged on some previous occasions. I believe when the provincial government looked at some possibilities for amendments to the Pension Benefit Act back in 1998, that the possibility of removal of this grow-in provision, the sections 78 and 79 of the existing Act, was flagged at that time in a discussion paper. Now, it's only a discussion paper, but it was flagged at the time as a possibility for something that could be removed. So it does have a history that is not tied exclusively to HRM. I cannot say that I favored it then, and as I said, we've worried about this and we've tended to be skeptical about it and have again reached the conclusion that we don't favor it now. We would take a huge amount of convincing. Now, what we're faced with is the issue having been identified in Nova Scotia as early as 1998 as something that might be removed. We have the instance in front of us of HRM that seems to be looking for this change and claiming that it's an expensive item for them. And we also have, I think, some confusion in terms of the position of all organized labor in Nova Scotia. I recall that the Nova Scotia Federation of Labor in the spring of this year wrote to, I think, the minister, perhaps to all members of the legislature, or perhaps just to some caucus members, I can't recall, indicating that they thought in general they supported the call by HRM to remove these sections, these protective sections of the Pension Benefits Act. Now, normally, of course, if the Federation of Labor had reached that conclusion, we in this caucus would be extremely hesitant about taking a different position. Now, that's one of the reasons that we continued to have talks with the Federation and with other members of organized labor in Nova Scotia. I think I heard the Honourable Minister in his introduction suggest that there was support from the Federation of Labor for his Bill 129. Mr. Speaker, I would like to table, if I could, a letter to the Minister dated October 7th from the President of the Federation of Labor, Mr. Rick Clark. He indicates, I think, something different than the Minister had suggested. He suggests that at this point, the Federation of Labor is not necessarily in support of Bill 129 and is looking forward to further consultation and tentatively reaches the view that they don't really support this bill. So what I'm tabling is a letter that's addressed to the Minister. I don't know if he's seen it yet, but I've tabled it now, so it's certainly available to the Minister. You know, there is, I think, no better sign of maturity than a frank willingness to change your mind upon mature reflection. Absolutely. And if what we have here is something from the Nova Scotia Federation of Labor in which they've indicated that upon more mature reflection they've changed their mind, then I read that only as something sensible, as them taking advantage of the passage of the interim months to think in more depth about the problem. And as I said at the beginning, pensions are complicated matters. Pensions are an area, in many respects, for experts. Pensions are one of those things that have to be approached very cautiously, very carefully. Pensions have to be looked at in detail. So I don't think the Minister can really say that there is undivided support for this proposal from organized labor. I think the situation is that labor is certainly, at the very least, looking for wider consultation among potential affected members of employee groups in Nova Scotia. Indeed, I think we have to follow the advice of the Federation of Labour in this regard and encourage the minister to undertake further and more detailed consultations before going ahead with this bill. This bill, I think, would be a prime candidate for setting aside for further thought. Now, I know that our superintendent of pensions belongs to a national organization called the Canadian Association of Pension Supervisory Authorities, CAPSA, CAPSA. And CAPSA is working towards a model pension law. This is an interesting and I would say commendable exercise. To have the same Pension Benefit Act in place across the country in each province would make a lot of sense. It would give a certain amount of security, of framework, of understanding for employers and employees as they move around the country. But at the same time, the desire to have a uniform statute does not have to be the overwhelming principle. If we have something different in our statute, although it's not unique in the country, I pointed out that Ontario, with 40% of the Canadian population and a very dynamic part of our Canadian national economy, has the same provision. There's no necessity to change it. It might be desirable to have many other aspects of the Pension Benefits Act read the same in Nova Scotia as they read in BC and Alberta and Quebec and Saskatchewan and so on. That would make sense. But if we have something that is an extra benefit that makes policy sense here, we don't have to abandon it. So again, I ask the question, where is this proposal coming from? Where is this proposal in Bill 129 to take away a legislated benefit that is of advantage to our employees? Where is it coming from? The pension supervisors, I think, are not pushing hard for it. They recognized it as something that only 2 provinces have, and so maybe it could be removed, but that's hardly the same thing as saying that it's necessary to remove it. We do know that there is a letter from HRM, and we know that the Federation of Labour was asked whether it had any particular stance on this, and we've heard slightly different things from them over time. So the focus, I think, turns to HRM. I was quite intrigued to see that the letter that came to our caucus from HRM, including the letter from the mayor, including the backup letters from the chair of the pension committee at HRM, came in an envelope with a Mercer name and return address on the outside. Now, I saw the Mercer company at work during the amalgamation process. And by amalgamation in this case, I mean the very protracted talks about the putting together of the pension plan at HRM after the effective legal amalgamation of the municipalities. And I have to say that between 1996 and 1998, when I had to leave off in the process, having come to this House, that I got the distinct impression that Mercers, as pension experts and as pension advisors, were a little less than neutral in the process. I got the distinct impression that they were doing their best to encourage the employees to sign on to formulas for the translation of the benefits that they had in their pre-existing pension plans as reinterpreted in a merged pension plan that were not as good as they probably should have been. So I have to tell you that, speaking for myself, I view proposals for changes in our legislation that clearly take away a benefit to a worker that comes, in part, from Mercer's with no little skepticism. So I worry about this. But you know what? However useful it is to say to ourselves, check the source, the issue still is, what about the content of what we're being asked to do? The content still is that this is a proposal to remove a benefit from employees that those employees will have paid for in part already. It's already been built into the actuarial assumptions that have gone to the funding of the plan up to the date of its full or partial wind-up. I say phooey. I don't see that this makes sense. So what can justify this? I have to say that I haven't heard any convincing proposal from the minister to explain why it is that he wants to take this benefit away. I've heard him make, to the best of my ability to listen, 2 points. One is, he says, it affects virtually nobody. Well, let's just deal with that one for a minute. First, it doesn't matter if it affects virtually nobody. Even if that were true, it doesn't matter. If we have a good benefit, a sensible provision in our laws that affects somebody, then we can support it. We don't have to take it away. Furthermore, someday it might affect people. And indeed, there have been examples in this province where it actually has affected people, or would have if it had not been the law at the time. And I'm talking about HRM and I'm talking about Ultramar. And who's to say that there won't be another employer wanting full or partial wind-up of their pension plan at some point in the future? So to say that it affects virtually nobody gets us nowhere. I have to say this is one of the least convincing of suggested arguments or props for an argument that I've heard. So that's the first thing. I don't think we derive much comfort or nor are we convinced by this part of what the minister says. But let's look at the second part of what the minister says, because I think this must be the more serious part of what it is that's actually at issue here. And he says that it costs a lot of money, that this is going to cost employers and pension plans a lot of money. And indeed, you know what? That's what it is that they say in the letter from HRM, and that's what they say in the letter from their pension plan or pension committee chairs, co-chairs, that this might cost us a lot of money. Now, you know what? I have a lot of sympathy with that. I do. I pay attention to money issues, and when I chaired the pension committee at HRM, believe me, we spent a lot of time making sure that the funds were invested through professional investors who were held accountable to make sure that they produced the proper rate of return to pay the amount of money that was guaranteed to employees upon their retirement. We took this very seriously. Many of you will know Bernard Smith, who for a time after he left the city of Halifax as its director of finance, became the deputy minister of finance for this province. Bernard Smith and I served on that committee together. Bernard Smith, I think, is widely recognized as a man of integrity and a man of very sound and sensible financial practices. Bernard Smith and I spent a lot of time together making sure that that pension plan that was in existence pre-amalgamation municipally in Nova Scotia for the City of Halifax employees was soundly administered and had the money to pay the defined benefit results that the employees had negotiated and that the employer had agreed to. This is the key. The key is the performance of the pension plan at HRM subsequent to amalgamation. Now, I'm not saying that it's been poorly administered. I don't have any information to tell me that at all. But I do know that, of course, there was a time a few years ago when the market went through some downturns. I wouldn't be at all surprised if the pension plan, the amalgamated pension plan, was having some difficulty with their investments. But you know what? Pension plans, particularly in the public sector, where you have entities like municipalities, like hospitals, like provincial governments, are for the long term. They're for the very long term. Some years the investments do well, some years they don't do so well. That happens. There are ups and downs. I do not believe that if there is a problem with the investments of the HRM pension plan, that the solution is to come here and say, let us take away a statutory protection for our employees to qualify in the circumstances of an early retirement benefit that was promised to them before. And you know what? I bet when they calm down, the HRM Pension Committee will probably take the same view. And you know what? I say to HRM as employers, and I say to all employers in the province, that if they don't like this statutory provision, they have an option open to them. They can go to their employees and try to negotiate at the bargaining table for a reduction or a removal of the early retirement benefit. Let's recall that our statutory provision that Bill 129 proposes to take away only guarantees this benefit when it's previously been negotiated by the employer and the employees. It's nothing to do with us here. If employers find this to be too expensive, then they have a second alternative on top of negotiations. They can get better pension administrators for the funds that they have in their plan. Or they can just wait, because the market's doing a lot better now. These are good years. Excuse me, Mr. Speaker, I think there might be an interruption from an honourable member.
Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, I'm a little unclear what he's saying, but I just want to make sure I'm clear on what I heard him say. I think he is saying that contract takes place over legislation, and I think that's what you said. As a matter of fact, I'm sure that's what you said.
The honourable member for Halifax Atlantic has the floor, or Halifax Abucto has.
Good. Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm extremely happy to have this opportunity to address myself directly to the Minister of Education and remind him of something. I want to remind him that repetition is the basic teaching tool. So I'm going to say what I had to say again, and in the hopes that he actually hears it correctly this time. This is why it is that they have us sitting in rows reciting the 6 times table when we're in grade 3. You keep saying it until you get it right. So I don't believe, Mr. Speaker, that I did say that contract takes precedence over legislation. What I did say, no. What I did say was that our legislative provision only comes into play in circumstances in which the employer and employee have previously negotiated a benefit. Once the benefit has been negotiated, then our statutory provision actually provides a guarantee that as of a certain point, it can't be taken away. What I am saying is that if the employer doesn't like it, they can go back and not take away anything that has been guaranteed by statute. They can't take away what's been guaranteed by statute. But for future employees, they can certainly say, we don't like this and it's not going to be on offer for anybody else. So that's what I said is available to them. The other, all right, perhaps I wasn't so clear. I will go so far as saying, Mr. Speaker, as agreeing, Mr. Speaker, that I might have made my point more clearly, and I thank the Minister for affording me the opportunity to clarify. All right. Now, there is another option available, as I said, to employers, which is to try to make sure that their plans are properly funded. And if they don't think that their plans are performing well enough in the market, they can look for better professional advisors. I'm not saying it's guaranteed. I'm not saying that this isn't tricky. What I am saying is that there shouldn't be any panic on the part of employers. So in the end, where we are with this, Mr. Speaker, is we can't see a good reason for going along with this proposal, which takes away something that looks to us to be a sensible guarantee for employees in this province. When I consider the points that have been put forward in justification, and when I consider the history here, particularly the history of employees who have found themselves in circumstances where their employment, their businesses have wound up earlier than they expected, I think we have a very rational, a very sensible protection for employees, and that's why our caucus has reached the point of deciding that we can't support this bill. We look forward to hearing any arguments that might come forward that might convince us otherwise, but so far our investigation of this complicated subject makes us think that we cannot support the bill. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to it.
Thank you. I recognize the honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on this particular piece of legislation, Bill number 129, a revision to the Pension Benefits Act. Mr. Speaker, this is an issue that obviously has come up on a number of occasions over previous years, and I was quite keen on what some of the observations that were made by the previous speaker, particularly as I sought to secure some detail as to some particular cases here in Nova Scotia where this issue on the grow-in benefits or the lack of it would have caused some considerable consternation for employees involved in pension plans, either publicly or privately throughout Nova Scotia. And I really haven't heard any particular detail with regards to Nova Scotia situation. So he made reference to the situation of Massey Ferguson in Ontario, and I don't have all the details on that, so I have to accept at face value at this point what the honourable member was saying. But and I'm not even so sure all the parameters on that particular issue apply to the extent that they do here in Nova Scotia. But Mr. Speaker, as I understand, there are a number of problems with this entire grow-in provision, and not being a financial advisor or planner or somebody someone who does not have an extensive background in finance, as perhaps the Minister of Finance or other learned colleagues in the legislature here, I do want to outline what I see as some of the problems as it exists now, and why perhaps this particular piece of legislation may or would be appropriate. A major problem with the grow-in provision is that employers are required every 3 years to calculate the total liability of the pension plan as if it were wound up today. And with or without the grow-in provision, Mr. Speaker, the employer would have to account for this solvency liability, but the grow-in provision adds significant cost to the total liability of the pension plan. Further, Mr. Speaker, employers are given 5 years to pay off any shortfalls, and the shortfalls largely created by the grow-in provision must be paid off in lump sums. Roughly speaking, 80% of the plans in Nova Scotia are unfunded at this particular point in time. So to continue with this grow-in provision is going to further the debt situation with these pension plans, particularly the previous speaker made reference to the Halifax Regional Municipality, Well, the total unfunded liability of that pension plan with the grow-in provision, I believe, is somewhere in the vicinity of, what, $70 million. $70 million. Well, for the life of me, I really don't see the Halifax Regional Municipality going bankrupt tomorrow or any time in the near future. In fact, it's perhaps one of the most lucrative municipal institutions in the country. Certainly, if certainly not in the province of Nova Scotia, for sure. But, Mr. Speaker, the initial cost to the taxpayers of the Halifax Regional Municipality, and I say the taxpayers because it's their money. They have to pay the taxes. Now, the previous speaker spoke very eloquently about HRM as if it was some type of a corporate entity severed from the public interest. But it's the taxpayers, the property taxpayers in the Halifax Regional Municipality that have to foot this bill of $70 million with the support of what the NDP are trying to initiate here today. And I think that's very counterproductive. And I don't think any member of the NDP caucus would like to go back and tell their constituents that they want to increase their taxes because of this provision that will help to alleviate a lot of frustration that not only the employer, the Halifax Regional Municipality, but also the employees' representatives are asking for this piece of legislation. And the NDP will stand here and say, no, we would rather put your taxes up to meet our dogmatic view of socialism. Now, I think that's disgraceful that they would rather stick the Halifax regional taxpayers with a $70 million tax bill. Why don't they put it on the table and say it as it is, Mr. Speaker? They want to drive the taxes up in the Halifax Regional Municipality. Why? Why, Mr. Speaker? That is the question. Now, if not only the employer, but the employees, the workers, are asking for this, why are the NDP against it? If the universities are asking for it, not just the administration, but the employees, they're asking for it, why are the NDP against it? Mr. Speaker, we don't know. Mr. Speaker, roughly speaking, about 5% of a company's budget is required to pay growing cost. And in some cases, the cost can be hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. This is on top of the regular pension benefits that are set aside by both the employers and the employees. Although the cost to the employers is real, the wind-up event is hypothetical and unlikely to occur. Universities, hospitals, municipalities, and yes, Mr. Speaker, private companies, the 140 plus that the Honourable Speaker before has referenced, are required to account for these high growing costs, even though the likelihood of them winding up a pension plan is rare and next to impossible. Because employees are having to put increased resources to cover the cost of growing provision, money is not spent on jobs, infrastructure, new technologies, and so on. Which obviously, Mr. Speaker, is reflected in great thought, I believe, in the letter that was provided by the President of the Federation of Labour to the Honourable Ron Russell, Minister of Labour and Environment, a little more than a year ago, on this very issue, representing Labour from one end of this province to the other, asking for this legislation. And lo and behold, and I'll give you the details of it in a moment, Mr. Speaker, lo and behold, on the same day that the Minister of Labour present introduces the legislation, what happens? Shortly after an encounter with the NDP caucus, which the President of the Federation of Labour is noted for, attending NDP caucus meetings, what's he come? He comes back to the conversion that, look, he can't. He can't support this legislation. So he offers a letter of apology on behalf of his membership to the NDP caucus under the veil of a letter to the Minister of Labour. I think this is absolutely disgraceful to sell out the workers of the province of Nova Scotia for political purposes. That's essentially what this letter says, Mr. Speaker. It is, and I quote, Mr. Speaker, from the letter dated October 7, 2004, "It is rather noticed that until we have an opportunity to consult with those who would be potentially impacted in this matter, we wish to be on the record as being opposed." A year and a half after he wrote the first letter, after extensive consultations at that point, he's coming back and says, "We haven't consulted." Well, what's going on in that NDP caucus meeting or meetings? It's just absolutely mind-boggling. He goes on to say, Mr. Speaker, also until further notice and/or until a replacement position or letter is received, who knows how many more letters he's going to send, our correspondence of May 9, 2003 no longer reflects our position on this matter. Well, to me, to quote the honourable leader of the NDP, that's considered a flip-flop. It's a flip-flop, Mr. Speaker. But I do want to speak to the essence of this particular piece of legislation.
The honourable member for Halifax-Shabukto on a point of order.
Well, I wondered, Mr. Speaker, if the honourable member would entertain a question.
The honourable member Cape Breton West, entertain a question.
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Question period on Friday. The honourable member for Halifax-Shabukto.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for returning the favour from a little earlier in the proceedings. I just wanted to know, Mr. Speaker, if the honourable member was aware that this bill is not confined in its impact to HRM, but in fact extends to every employer in the province similarly placed.
Honourable member Cape Breton West.
Well, Mr. Speaker, if he had heard the comments that I made earlier, he would have clearly understood I was speaking about public and private plans. But perhaps he missed that point, and I understand why he did. But given the consideration of the letters that we have before us, it doesn't surprise me what position they're going to have on Tuesday. The President of the Federation of Labour, and I think this is very, very important to put on the public record, Mr. Speaker, because it speaks to the essence of what Labour in this province has been saying with regards to this very issue of the grow-in provision on pensions. I quote, "One such item is the requirement to assume that all members who have at least 55 points, that's a combination of age and service, retire at the earliest date they would be eligible for an unreduced pension, assuming that they have continued membership in the pension plan. The provision is known as the grow-in rule. Grow-in is a statutory enhancement of early retirement benefits required only under the pension legislation of Nova Scotia. Grow-in goes further than protecting a cured benefit. It actually requires that the employers, and in many cases members, make contributions which may ultimately not be required to fund the benefits of the plan." And in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, the President of the Federation of Labour states, "We hereby request that the province of Nova Scotia amend the Pension Benefits Act of Nova Scotia by removing the grow-in requirements." Mr. Speaker, clearly the Federation of Labour supports this legislation, despite the letter of apology that was issued yesterday